Amara had survived war zones, betrayal, and a boss who trusted no one, but nothing prepared her for the night Seoul's most dangerous man looked at her like she was worth dying for, and an engagement announcement with her name on it that she never signed. If you believe love should never be used as a weapon to steal power, hit subscribe and drop a like right now. Only the manipulators, the fame chasers, and the ones who think people are just pieces on a chessboard would scroll past without smashing that button. Stay. Amara's fight is just beginning. Seoul didn't so much greet Amara as it dared her. The city glittered like a threat wrapped in neon, and somewhere between the airport and the penthouse district, she decided she liked it. Danger had always been honest with her. Unlike people, 3 years earlier, a roadside explosion in a war zone she legally wasn't allowed to name had taken her entire unit and left her with a limp. She'd trained herself to hide better than most people hid affairs. The military called it an honorable discharge. Amara called it the day the universe decided she'd cheated death enough times to owe it a favor. She just didn't know yet that the favor would come wearing a $3,000 suit and a scowl that could curdle milk. The recruiter, a nervous little man who sweated through his shirt like it owed him money, had slid a folder across a diner table in D.C. Inside was a photograph of a man with a jaw carved for arguments he always won and eyes that did math on you before you'd even sat down. Kingpin, the recruiter said. Seoul's most feared syndicate boss. He needs protection. Amara had laughed, actual laughter, the kind that made the waitress look over. You want me to protect that? He looks like he negotiates with hurricanes. We want you to protect an empire, the recruiter corrected, mopping his forehead. He just happens to be wearing it. That should have been her first warning. The second came 3 days later, when she stood in Min Jae's penthouse, floor-to-ceiling windows, a view expensive enough to be its own zip code, and he looked her up and down like she was an inconvenience he hadn't budgeted for. I don't hire women, he said in English too crisp to be an accident, or Americans, or optimists. Good thing I'm none of those things today, Amara said. I'm just the person standing between you and the 6 ways someone in this room could kill you before your coffee gets cold. Min Jae's jaw tightened, the closest thing to surprise the man allowed himself in public. There's no one else in this room. Exactly, Amara said. And you didn't notice the door behind you was unlocked until I said something. That's the problem I'm here to fix. He didn't hire her that day. He didn't fire her either, which in Min Jae's world was practically a marriage proposal. She stayed the week out of stubbornness and stayed the month because on day 9, in an underground parking garage that smelled like gasoline and bad decisions, a bullet meant for Min Jae's skull found her shoulder instead because she'd shoved him sideways half a second before impact reduced her contract negotiations to a hospital bed. He visited her that night. Didn't say much. Sat in the corner chair like a man doing penance, watching the monitor beep instead of watching her, because looking directly at things he cared about had never gone well for him. You're supposed to run, he said eventually. Everyone runs eventually. It's cheaper than staying. I read the contract, Amara said, voice rough from the anesthesia. Running wasn't in the fine print. He didn't answer. Some silences she was learning said more than most men's whole vocabularies. Here is the sharpest, most inconvenient truth about proximity. It is a slow poison with no antidote. And Seoul at midnight was lousy with rain-slicked alleys built for exactly that kind of poisoning. Every escape route they ran together, every late-night silence in adjoining hotel rooms where she listened for footsteps that shouldn't exist, wore down the wall between employer and man one brick at a time. She started noticing the version of him that only came out after 2 a.m., a tired, unbearably lonely person doing crossword puzzles because it was the one silence in his life he still controlled. And Min Jae, cold, calculating, allergic to trust, started noticing a woman who never once flinched at his reputation, only at memories of a war he was smart enough never to ask about. Neither of them said the word growing between them. Some sentences they both understood were safer left as ellipses. They had no idea an entire political dynasty was about to say it for them, on live television, in front of cameras, with a ring that wasn't Min Jae's. The first 3 weeks after the parking garage taught Amara something about Min Jae that no dossier could have prepared her for. The man ran his empire like a chessboard, but he flinched. Actually flinched, whenever she winced reaching for her coffee with her injured shoulder. You could hire a physical therapist, he said one morning. not looking up from a stack of documents that probably represented several small countries' GDP. I could, Amara agreed. Or you could stop pretending you're not staring. He didn't deny it. That was new too. Seoul in autumn had a particular kind of cruelty to it, beautiful enough to make you forget you were standing in a war zone with better lighting. Amara had started to learn the rhythms of Minjae's world the way she'd once learned terrain. The men who bowed too low were usually hiding something. The smiles that lasted a half second too long belonged to people calculating angles. And the safest room in any building was the one with two exits and Minjae's back against a wall he trusted. He trusted very few walls. He was, she'd come to understand, a man who'd inherited a war instead of a company at 19, when his father's retirement turned out to be a bullet with impeccable timing. Loyalty to Min Jae had always been a rental agreement, paid in fear, collected in blood, renewed only under duress. Amara didn't fit that arrangement, and it unsettled him in ways he refused to name. "Why do you do this?" he asked her once, on a rooftop overlooking Gangnam, the city humming beneath them like a live wire. Not the job. This, the questions, the coffee-staring accusations. Most people who work for me learn silence very quickly. Silence gets people killed, Amara said. I watched it happen. A whole unit's worth of it, actually, because someone decided the smart move was staying quiet about a threat instead of speaking up. I don't do quiet anymore. Not the kind that gets someone buried. Min Jae studied her the way he studied ledgers for the lie hidden in the numbers. He found none. That, more than anything, was the moment he stopped treating her like hired help and started treating her like a variable he couldn't predict, which for a man who'd built an empire on predictability was terrifying in a way gunfire had never managed to be. 3 nights later, someone tried poisoning his wine at a business dinner. Amara caught the scent before he lifted the glass. Bitter almond. The kind of detail only someone who'd survived field medicine training would clock in under 2 seconds. She knocked the glass from his hand so fast the crystal shattered against the marble floor, like an accusation. The room went silent. 12 men in expensive suits, all of them suddenly very interested in their napkins. Careful, Amara said, voice level, eyes scanning the table. Someone at this table doesn't like the seating arrangement. Minjae didn't move, didn't blink, just looked at the shattered glass, then at her, and something in his expression cracked open just slightly. Not fear, not gratitude exactly, but the particular unraveling of a man realizing that somebody, for the first time in a decade, actually wanted him alive for reasons that had nothing to do with what he could offer them. Later that night, back at the penthouse, he poured 2 glasses of water, plain, boring, undoctored water, and handed her one without a word. It was the closest thing to a thank you he had in his vocabulary. You keep doing that, he said, choosing me, over logic, over self-preservation. I'm not choosing you, Amara said, though the words came out slower than she intended, like she was testing their weight before committing to them. I'm doing my job. Your job, Minjae repeated, something almost like amusement flickering across that closed-door jaw of his, does not usually come with this much personal risk. Neither does yours, she shot back. And yet here we both are. Outside, Seoul kept glittering, indifferent to the two people quietly rearranging the walls they'd built around themselves. Somewhere across the city, in a boardroom neither of them knew existed yet, a political family was already drafting a press release with Amara's name on it, a name they hadn't asked to use, attached to a wedding neither of them had agreed to. The empire hadn't cracked from bullets. It hadn't cracked from poison. But somewhere in that shattered wine glass, in that unspoken exchange of water and silence, the first hairline fracture had already begun. The kind that doesn't show on the surface until the whole structure comes down at once. Loyalty, in Kang Min-jae's organization, was measured the way other men measured rainfall, in inches, in increments, always assumed to evaporate eventually. So when his second-in-command, a smooth-talking man named Du-yeon who'd been at Min-jae's side since their teenage years running errands for the old boss, started showing up to meetings a little too early and leaving a little too late, Amara noticed before anyone else did. She'd learned in another life that the deadliest people rarely announce themselves. They arrived early. They remembered your coffee order. They asked about your shoulder with just enough warmth that you almost forgot to ask why they cared. You don't like him, Min-jae said one evening. watching her watch Du Yun across the war room, where maps of shipping routes and rival territories sprawled across every surface like a game only 3 people in the world understood the rules to. I don't trust anyone who remembers everyone's birthday, Amara said. It's either genuine kindness or professional-grade manipulation, and in this business, I know which one's more profitable. Min Jae almost smiled. Almost. He's been with me since I was 17. He carried me out of a building once after I took a beating meant to teach my father a lesson. That's a good story, Amara said. Doesn't mean it's still true. He didn't argue with her, which by now she understood was its own kind of concession. Min Jae had built a life out of never admitting doubt out loud, as if doubt itself were a currency he refused to spend. But she'd caught him, twice now, looking at Du Yun with the particular unease of a man recalculating a number he'd thought was fixed. It was around this time, 3 weeks into a fragile, unnamed thing neither of them dared put a label on, that Amara started attending the events, the galas, the political dinners, the endless parade of Seoul's elite pretending civility while their eyes did inventory on each other's net worth. She hated them. Not because of the champagne or the small talk, but because rooms full of powerful people smiling too widely were, in her professional opinion, rooms one bad decision away from a body count. It was at one such dinner, hosted by a political family with a surname that opened doors and closed investigations in equal measure, that she first met Representative Junho Baek's son, a young man with a jaw that had clearly been engineered in a lab designed to produce campaign posters. He shook her hand a half-second too long. Ms. Amara, he said, like her name was a delicacy he'd been saving. I've heard remarkable things. I doubt that, she said. I try not to be memorable in rooms like this. Too late, he said, smiling in a way that made her skin itch. You already are. She thought nothing of it at the time, filed it under the general category of politicians being unsettling, a category with an alarmingly high population. She didn't know yet that somewhere behind that smile, an entire dynasty had already decided her name belonged to their family, whether she'd agreed to it or not. That night, walking Min Jae back to his car through an underground lot, lit like a crime scene waiting to happen, she felt it again. That itch at the base of her skull that had kept her alive in places with worse odds than Seoul. She didn't say anything, just moved half a step closer to him, angled her body toward the exits, the way she always did when something in the air didn't sit right. You're doing the thing, Min Jae said quietly. What thing? The thing where you go quiet right before something happens. Nothing's happening, she said. Yet, he studied her for a long moment, headlights from a passing car sliding gold across his face. You say that like you already know it will. I've survived long enough to trust my gut over good manners, Amara said. And my gut says somebody in your circle isn't just watching your empire. They're watching me too, closely. Min Jae didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped into the register he reserved for things that actually frightened him. Quiet, controlled, dangerous. Then we find out who, before they decide watching isn't enough. Neither of them knew yet how right that instinct was, or how close the betrayal sat, not in the shadows, not among strangers, but at the very table where Min Jae broke bread every week with men he'd called brothers, since before either of them had learned to be careful with the word. The trap wasn't coming. It had already been built. All that was left now was the unveiling, and it would happen in the very last place either of them expected. Under 1,000 camera flashes, dressed as a celebration. The National Heritage Charity Gala was the kind of event where old money pretended to care about orphans for exactly 3 hours a year, purely for the photo opportunity. Amara had attended enough of these in the past month to recognize the choreography, the practiced humility, the false modesty, the way every handshake in the room was really a transaction wearing a tuxedo. She wore black. Always black. Not for fashion, but because black didn't show blood as easily, a fact she'd never voiced to Min Jae because some truths were better left unspoken between people who'd started, against every professional instinct she had, to actually like each other. You look like you're planning an exit strategy, Min Jae murmured beside her, adjusting his cufflink with the practiced boredom of a man who'd attended 1,000 of these nights and hated every single one. I'm always planning an exit strategy, Amara said. Tonight's just got more chandeliers than usual. The chandeliers, in fact, were the least dangerous thing in the room. Representative Bake and his son had arrived 20 minutes earlier, trailed by a documentary crew, and enough security to suggest either extreme importance or extreme guilt. In Amara's experience, usually both. Du-Yun stood near the bar, laughing a little too loudly at a joke that hadn't been that funny, and Amara filed the observation away in the growing folder in her head, labeled things that don't add up. For a fragile hour, it almost felt normal. Min-jae, against every instinct in his cold, calculating body, pulled her onto the dance floor during a slow song. Not because dancing was in the job description, but because for once, he wanted 5 minutes where the only thread in the room was the way she looked at him when she thought no one was watching. "This is a terrible idea," Amara said, even as her hands settled into his. "Most good ideas start that way," Min-jae replied. And for a moment, one single, unguarded moment, the Empire, the war, the traitor, somewhere in the room, all of it fell away. And there was just a tired man and a woman who'd stopped pretending she hadn't noticed him noticing her. Then the microphone crackled to life, and the moment died like everything good eventually does in rooms built for ambition instead of honesty. Representative Bake took the stage with the ease of a man who'd never once been told to sit down. "Tonight," he began, voice booming through speakers that cost more than most people's houses, "is not just about charity. It's about the future, about legacies, about the joining of families who understand what it means to build something greater than themselves." Amara felt Min-jae go rigid beside her a half-second before she understood why. "It is my great honor," Beck continued, "to announce the engagement of my son, Jun-suk, to Miss Amara, a woman whose courage and grace embody everything our two families hope to build together." The room erupted into applause. Cameras flashed like artillery fire. Jun-suk stepped forward, smiling the same lab-engineered smile from their first meeting, extending a hand toward her as though the decision had already been ratified by God and several television networks. Amara did not move. Her champagne glass trembled in her hand, not from fear, she would insist to herself later, but from the particular cold fury of realizing she'd become a headline in a story she'd never agreed to write. She had survived war zones with clearer rules than this. Nobody had asked her. Nobody had warned her. She had simply become collateral in someone else's negotiation, packaged as a fairy tale for an audience hungry for one. Beside her, Min-jae's face had gone unreadable in the way it only did right before he made someone very, very sorry. He said nothing. He smiled. Thin, practiced, dangerous. And the room, mistaking his silence for consent, applauded harder. But Amara knew better. She'd learned his silences the way she'd once learned enemy terrain, and this one wasn't defeat. This one was the sound of an empire quietly, deliberately, declaring war. If you've ever watched someone else make a decision about your life without asking, a boss, a family, a system that assumes your silence means agreement, you already know the fury simmering under Amara's calm right now. Drop a comment. Would you have smiled for the cameras or flipped the table? Only the people who think consent is optional would stay quiet on this one. Like and subscribe if you believe nobody, politician, boss, or otherwise, gets to script your life without your signature. Later that night, in the marble stillness of an empty hallway, Min-jae finally spoke, voice low enough that only she could hear it. "That was not a proposal," he said. "That was a hostage negotiation dressed in a tuxedo." "I noticed," Amara said. "They think taking you off the board weakens me." "Does it?" Min-jae's jaw tightened, the closed door finally, dangerously, beginning to open. "It makes me reckless." Which is worse? The morning after the gala, Min-jae's penthouse looked like a war room disguised as luxury real estate. Laptops open, security footage looping on 3 monitors, and Amara standing at the center of it with the particular stillness of a woman who'd stopped being angry and started being dangerous instead. "Whoever arranged this," she said, "didn't just know my schedule. They knew which night I'd be photographed without a jacket that could hide a weapon. They knew the exact camera angle that would make the story unmissable by morning. That's not opportunism. That's planning. Which means someone gave them the information," Min-jae finished, voice flat in the way that meant he already suspected the answer and hated it. Amara pulled up the building's internal security logs, schedules, entry points, movement patterns that only a handful of people had access to. She'd spent half the night cross-referencing timestamps, the kind of tedious, unglamorous work that never made it into the stories people told about bodyguards, but was, in her experience, 90% of what actually kept people alive. There it was, a data pull 3 weeks prior, time-stamped at 2:47 a.m., pulled from a terminal registered to Du Yun. Min Jae stared at the screen for a long moment, and Amara watched something in him fracture quietly, privately, the way structures fail, not with a bang, but with a slow internal give that nobody sees until the whole thing comes down. He carried me out of a burning building, Min Jae said, almost to himself. I was 17. He didn't have to. Maybe he didn't then, Amara said, careful, because she understood this wasn't just betrayal. It was grief wearing betrayal's clothes. People change. Or maybe he was always waiting for a better offer, and it just took 20 years for one to arrive. Why? Min Jae said, and for the first time since she'd met him, his voice cracked at the edges like old varnish. I gave him everything. Money he couldn't spend in 3 lifetimes. Territory. Trust I've given no one else. Because trust isn't a debt people repay, Amara said quietly. It's a debt they decide one day they're tired of owing. They confronted Du Yun that afternoon, not with guns. Min Jae had learned, slowly, painfully, that Amara's methods worked better than his old ones. But with the quiet, surgical precision of laying evidence on a table and watching a man's face do all the confessing his mouth refused to. Du Yun didn't deny it. He didn't even look surprised, which was somehow worse than if he had. You brought in an American, he said, gesturing at Amara like she was the crime instead of the person who'd uncovered one. A woman who doesn't even speak the language properly, who doesn't understand 30 years of history, and you handed her more trust than you ever gave me. What did you think would happen? I think you were waiting for an excuse, Min Jae said, voice like ice over deep water. And she just happened to be a convenient one. The Beck family offered me a seat at the table, Du Yun said, unashamed now, almost relieved to finally say it out loud. Not a servant's seat, a real one. All I had to do was hand them a woman you'd eventually get tired of anyway. Amara felt the words land somewhere behind her ribs, sharp and cold, but she didn't flinch. She'd trained herself out of flinching a long time ago, in places far worse than a Seoul penthouse. You're wrong about one thing, she said, stepping forward. He wasn't going to get tired of me. That's exactly why you had to move fast. Min Jae didn't kill him. That surprised even Amara. Instead, he did something colder, stripped him of territory, of title, of every rental agreement loyalty had ever bought him, and sent him out into a city that would remember exactly what he'd done. Because in this world, reputation was the only currency crueler than money. That's mercy? Amara asked later, watching the city lights flicker below the penthouse windows. That's worse than mercy, Min Jae said. Mercy would have been quick. Outside, the wedding clock kept ticking. 3 days now, and counting, until Amara's stolen future arrived at a cathedral neither of them had agreed to walk into. The traitor was gone, but the trap he'd built still stood, gears turning, indifferent to the fact that its architect had already been removed from the board. They'll still come for the wedding, Amara said. Du Yun being gone doesn't stop the Becks. No, Min Jae agreed, something resolute settling into his voice for the first time since the gala. But now they come for it without a spy feeding them our next move. Now, for the first time, we know exactly where the battlefield is. 3 days before a wedding she'd never agreed to, Amara stood in a dress-fitting room surrounded by seamstresses she hadn't hired, adjusting a gown she hadn't chosen, for a ceremony designed to erase every choice she'd ever made about her own life. It was, she thought, a remarkably efficient way to disappear a person, not with a bullet, but with lace and a press release. You could refuse, Min Jae said, standing in the doorway like a man who'd walked into a room he had no strategy for. Publicly. Right now. And what happens then? Amara asked, watching the seamstress pin fabric she planned on never actually wearing to an altar. The Beggs release a story about how the Mafia boss's American bodyguard seduced her way out of a respectable engagement. Your organization looks weak for letting a woman dictate outcomes. Their family looks like victims. That's the whole design, Min Jae. Every path they've built leads to you losing something. Then we build a path they didn't account for. There's a novel concept, Amara said, dry as gravel. Should have tried that from the start, instead of standing there being tall and brooding about it. The corner of his mouth twitched, the closest thing to a laugh he allowed himself under this much pressure. It was a small thing, but she'd learned to treasure the small things in a life built out of large, dangerous ones. That night, they didn't sleep. They sat in the war room with the lights of Seoul bleeding through the windows, mapping out a plan that didn't rely on bullets. Because bullets, Amara had explained more than once, were what people expected. What nobody expected was the truth, delivered publicly, with better timing than any political dynasty could counter. You understand what this means, Min-jae said, somewhere around 3 a.m., voice quieter than she'd ever heard it. If I stand up in that cathedral and say what I actually feel, everyone will know. My rivals, my allies, every person who's ever mistaken my silence for weakness will finally have proof I'm capable of it. Weakness? Amara repeated. Is that what you think this is? I think, Min-jae said carefully, that I have spent 17 years making sure no one could ever use anything against me. And somewhere in the last 2 months, I let someone become the one thing worth losing everything for. That's either the smartest risk I've ever taken or the only mistake that will actually kill me. Amara didn't answer right away. She thought about the war zone, about the version of herself that used to believe safety meant never letting anyone matter enough to be a liability. She thought about how exhausting it had been, keeping that wall up, and how it had taken a cold, calculating Mafia boss with a crossword puzzle habit to make her forget, for entire hours at a time, why she'd built it. For what it's worth, she said finally, I've been mistaking your silences for a lot of things too. Turns out I was wrong about most of them. He looked at her then, really looked. The way he had in the parking garage the night a bullet found her shoulder instead of his skull. Like she was a variable he'd finally stopped trying to solve and started simply trusting. Then we do this together, Min-jae said, publicly. No more silence. The morning of the wedding arrived gray and humid, the kind of Seoul weather that felt like the city itself was holding its breath. Amara stood in the cathedral's back room, not in the gown the Becks had chosen, but in something entirely her own. Tactical enough to move in, elegant enough to survive the cameras. A small rebellion stitched into every seam. Representative Bake's people didn't know it yet, but the guest list included more than politicians and syndicate men. Intelligence agents Min-jae had quietly called in favors from sat scattered among the pews, watching. Amara had spent the last 3 days building a case airtight enough that no smiling politician's PR team could spin their way out of it. Falsified consent documents, financial records showing exactly how much the Beck family stood to gain from absorbing Min-jae's empire through marriage instead of war, and testimony, reluctantly given, from a stripped and humiliated Do-Yun who had nothing left to protect by staying quiet. If you've ever had to build your own exit out of a trap someone else designed for you, with nothing but preparation, patience, and receipts, you already know exactly how Amara feels walking into that cathedral. Comment below if you think truth beats violence every time. Subscribe if you refuse to let manipulators, liars, and power-hungry families write the ending to somebody else's story. The music began. The doors of the cathedral opened, and Kang Min-jae, for the first time in his entire carefully armored life, walked in first, unarmed, unguarded, and utterly done with silence. The cathedral had been built for peace, which made it an almost comedic setting for the war about to unfold inside it. Amara stood at the edge of the aisle, watching Min-jae walk in ahead of her. No entourage, no bodyguards flanking him for the first time in 17 years. Just a man who decided that whatever happened next, he wasn't going to face it hiding behind anyone else's shield. Representative Bake rose from the front pew, confusion flickering across his campaign poster face. Min-jae, this isn't part of the ceremony. No, Min-jae agreed, voice carrying easily through the cathedral's acoustics, built for hymns, and now hosting something considerably more honest. The ceremony was never the point, was it? The point was an empire, quietly stolen through paperwork and press releases, because bullets and poison had already failed you twice. A ripple moved through the pews. Cameras, because of course the Becks had invited cameras, vultures dressed as journalists, swung toward him, hungry for whatever headline came next. I have documents, Min-jae continued, nodding toward Amara, who stepped forward with a slim folder that had taken 3 sleepless nights to assemble, showing that Representative Bake's office falsified Amara's consent to this engagement. I have financial records showing exactly how much territory, how much influence your family stood to absorb the moment this marriage was finalized. And I have testimony from the man inside my own organization who sold you the information that made it all possible. Du Yun, stripped of everything but his conscience, sat in a back pew beside two of Min Jae's intelligence contacts, looking smaller than Amara had ever seen him. He didn't deny anything when the question came. He'd already lost too much to bother lying about the rest. Jun Suk, the groom with the engineered jaw, went pale beside the altar, suddenly very interested in his own shoes. Representative Bake's smile cracked like old plaster, revealing the panic underneath. The particular terror of a man who'd built his entire career on being untouchable, realizing in real time that untouchable was a myth built on nobody ever bothering to check the receipts. This is slander, Bake said, though his voice had lost its podium confidence. It's evidence, Amara said, stepping fully into the light now, done being a headline someone else had written. And unlike your press release, I actually consented to this part. The reporters, sensing blood, turned their cameras away from the ruined wedding and toward the real story. A political dynasty that had tried to steal an empire through a woman's stolen consent, exposed in the very cathedral built to legitimize the theft. By evening, it wouldn't be Amara's engagement trending across Seoul. It would be Bake's resignation, announced within 48 hours under pressure so swift and so public that even his allies couldn't afford to be seen defending him. If you've ever watched a liar's own arrogance become the thing that finally exposes them, you understand exactly what just happened in that cathedral. Like this, if you believe the truth always outlasts the lie, no matter how many cameras, how much money, or how much power the liar has behind them. Later, long after the cathedral had emptied and the story had detonated across every news outlet in the country, Amara found Min Jae standing alone on the same rooftop where he'd once asked her why she bothered choosing him at all. You could have let me disappear into that marriage, she said, joining him at the railing. Quietly, it would have been easier for your empire. Easier isn't the same as survivable, Min Jae said. I spent 17 years building walls so nothing could be used against me. Then you showed up, refused to be afraid of me, and made every single one of those walls feel like a waste of good architecture. Is that your version of a confession? It's the only version I have, he said, finally turning to look at her fully, jaw softened in a way she'd never seen in public, only ever in the quiet hours after 2 a.m. I don't know how to say the easy things, Amara. I only know how to protect what matters. So, I'm telling you it matters. You matter. More than the empire. More than the reputation. More than every rule I built my life around. Amara felt something in her chest loosen, the same wall she'd spent 3 years reinforcing since the war zone that took her unit, finally, quietly, giving way. For a man who doesn't do easy things, she said, stepping closer. That was almost romantic. Almost, Min-jae agreed, allowing himself, for the first time since she'd met him, a real and unguarded smile. Below them, Seoul kept glittering, glittering, shattered, and no longer quite so dangerous to touch. The empire hadn't fallen. It had simply, finally learned what it meant to have something worth protecting that wasn't for sale. And Amara, soldier, shield, survivor, discovered that the hardest part had never been protecting the world's most dangerous man. It was letting herself be loved by him without flinching.